his fingers around his tankard and poured the rest of Ned Hawthorne's famous dark brew down his throat with long, inelegant gulps. It was both cure and courage. He swiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "What colour am I now?" he asked defiantly. It was, in a way, the fault of his first South Sea expedition that he'd noticed Cynthia Brightly at all. It happened at a ball. The guest list for the enormous annual Malverney affair ranged in pedigree from Prinny to far less discriminate choices. Miles, as second son of the staggeringly wealthy and influential Isaiah Redmond, wasn't certain where he fell in the ranking, and didn't care. Miles's ship had docked in England again so recently, his complexion was still fading in degrees from tropical brown to a proper English shade of parchment, and had reached the sallow stage. He was still too thin for his large frame. Fevers, bad food, and a long ocean voyage did tend to strip flesh from a man. Roasts of beef and Yorkshire puddings were replenishing his. He'd taken a ragtag crew on a barely seaworthy ship to a swollen, pulsing, fever dream of a land. Brilliant flowers the size of parasols tangling with vines thicker round than a man's arms, snakes as supple and long as the vines themselves, beetles the size of St. Giles rats, ants the length of thumbs, noisy rainbow-feathered birds and iridescent butterflies the size of Chinese fans spangled the air. Dusky-skinned women as entangling as the flora shared his bed at night. Everything was abandoned, moist, outsized, and excessive. He learned to move slowly, languidly. He learned he would never be dry or cool, regardless. Death was as surprising and thickly everywhere as the life, hidden and overt, scuttling through the undergrowth as tiny scorpions, emerging from the trees as a tribe of cannibals with whom he successfully negotiated for his life, as a tenacious fever that nearly killed him anyway. Miles wasn't immune to awe, but the strangeness and dangers of Lacau never frightened him. Fear was usually rooted in ignorance, and he'd long ago learned to vanquish ignorance with preternatural patience and acute observation and tempered steel determination. And he recognized beauty, but he never exalted it. He understood the purpose of beauty in nature was to attract mates or prey, which, he decided dryly after more than 2 decades of observing his parents, his family and the Tor, was, in fact, its purpose in every society. And for this reason, he had never, for God's sake, challenged anyone to a duel, written terrible poetry, climbed balconies, as Colin Eversey had once been rumoured to do, or otherwise embarrassed himself over a beautiful woman. Miles quite sensibly and discreetly satisfied his formidable sensual appetites in the arms of the Ton's aristocratic widows, who considered him their best-kept secret. He would return to England to write the first of what would become a series of books about his adventures. This book would eventually earn him great notoriety, first among scientific circles which rippled concentrically outward to encompass fashionable circles, until he was avidly sought for lectures and salons and envied by men possessed of less fortitude or who were leg-shackled by wives and broods of children. This bemused Miles. He simply couldn't see his voyage as courageous or mythical when his nature gave him no choice in the matter. He was driven by a simple but quietly ferocious need to know things. Negotiating with cannibals for his life simply seemed a quite logical conclusion to the trajectory he'd been on since he was soundly thrashed for taking apart his father's gold watch when he was 7 years old. He'd had all the tiny, glittering pieces laid out before him, analysed and understood their relationship to one another, and was just about to reassemble it when he'd been caught. The thrashing did nothing at all to detract from the giddy triumph of finally understanding, at last, how the bloody thing worked. It was, however, a very important lesson. The quest for discovery was often a dangerous one. But all of this notoriety was a year away. For now, he was simply happy to be home again, among family, roasts of beef, low, uncluttered green landscapes, and discreet, randy aristocratic widows clothed in layers and layers of fabric that could be peeled or coaxed off. He was even happy to attend a ball, and he loathed balls. It just seemed a decidedly, blessedly English thing to do. But Lacau seemed to be relinquishing him only gradually, the way a dream dissolves into wakefulness. And suddenly, as Lord Albemarle stood at his elbow and pressed him for stories of warm-blooded women of easy virtue, it happened. The heat of the ballroom crush became tropical. the fluttering of silk fans.